Well, the United States Supreme Court heard arguments on Monday on an issue that's kind of interesting, at least for us legal geeks, Dave. You humor me because we did quicksand and skulls.
Yeah, that's right. I owe you this
so
one.
We'll,
Absolutely.
Yeah, there we go. President Trump had removed a Democratic member of the Federal Trade Commission for policy reasons, not for what we call for cause. The issue becomes whether or not he has the authority to do that. And we have some precedents in this country, legal precedent, because these are independent agencies, and they're independent for a reason. An elected official doesn't just get to appoint their Federal Trade Commissioner. There are certain bodies that we have decided have to have some autonomy and have to be apolitical.
Now, when you say we, I'm assuming that's through an act of Congress, or how does that come about?
Yeah, well, it's really been through the Supreme Court through years, but it is Congress, yes. But what can the president do? So to help us understand that's a great question. We've got Kelsey Dallas, managing editor of SCOTUSBlog. Kelsey, how badly did I butcher this?
No, you made sense of a complicated situation. So good setup for the conversation.
Okay, so what can you tell us about, because I'm looking here, it seems like the Supreme Court's leaning toward setting aside what is 90 years of legal precedent.
Yeah, this is a very interesting dispute because the Supreme Court had basically considered the exact same question in 1935 in a case called Humphrey's Executor, looking at whether it was appropriate for Congress to place limitations on when the president could remove a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission. And now that exact same question is before the court. Obviously, because it's during this term where the court is already wrestling with a number of difficult questions coming from the Trump administration, it puts a spin on this case where maybe a cynical observer is saying, oh, the court is just going to side with Trump. It always sides with Trump. But this case has a decades-old runway sort of leading up to it where the court has expressed frustration with that 1935 decision and said, was it really appropriate for the Congress to create these independent agencies? Is it appropriate for them to say these agencies live in the executive branch, but the head of the executive branch, the president, can't actually remove the leaders unless there is cause? So it was important to keep that context in mind yesterday, that this is a court that's, yes, grappling with a question brought up by President Trump, but also a question that's been sort of haunting the court for decades.
So this could have some fairly far-reaching effects, though, Kelsey, because we know that the president is not happy with the Fed in terms of interest rates, and that's another, I believe, independent agency. I mean, could this lead to other firings if the Supreme Court goes the way of the administration?
That's a great question. And yes, the court is going to look specifically at the Fed next month in a case that's about President Trump's effort to remove one of the Fed governors. I will say that during arguments yesterday, the same justices who seemed pretty open to the idea of Trump removing a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission without cause were expressing concern about the president being able to do the same thing with the Fed. There's a sense among court watchers that the Fed will be treated differently than other similarly situated agencies because the Fed is engaged in a different type of work.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
so
that is
you kind of piecemeal it. So it also seemed, Kelsey, and I'm just reading some of the articles about it, that the more liberal justices were not as willing to set aside 90 years of precedent as the conservative justices.
Right. The liberal justices are saying this is a dangerous move to undo something that has been in place for 90 years. They were saying that if you remove our assumptions about these independent agencies, potentially making them less independent because the president would get to have more significant say in the leadership and the ability to disrupt the leadership more regularly, that you're shaking the foundation of the country. Of course, there's also a different argument which says you have to shake this up because the structure is not working for the country anymore. And that's where a lot of the conservative justices are coming from, which is, yes, we may have traveled down this path for 90 years, but we've ended up in a place where agencies housed within the executive branch don't actually have anybody overseeing them, that the president can't carry out the policies the president wishes to carry out because there's no ability to replace a lot of these leaders.
So, Kelsey, at issue in this particular case is a woman named Rebecca Slaughter, who was a Democrat appointed to the Federal Trade Commission. To me, I'm wondering if there's any argument that at least the president has to have some reason for it, or is it just one of those, hey, you're the president and you can fire whoever you want?
The Trump administration and the conservative justices seem to open to this, are saying that the president wouldn't need to have a reason like dereliction of duty or irresponsible behavior, like that the president could really remove someone just because they don't feel like that person is in a position to carry out their policy priorities. However, this agency, as well as other multi-member independent agencies, there are rules for who the president can appoint to fill that spot. There are restrictions on the mix of Democrats and Republicans, for example. So it's not as if, even if the Supreme Court rules in Trump's favor, Trump would be able to have an all-Republican FTC. It would just come down to being able to remove one Democrat and replace that with another Democrat.
Kelsey, let me ask you another question. This is completely a shift here, but birthright citizenship, is that something the Supreme Court is taking up? And if so, do you know when we'll hear arguments on that?
Yes, the court just announced that on Friday. So listeners might be confused because, yes, the court did hear a birthright citizenship case last term and announced its decision in June, but that was really on this side issue about what lower courts can do to block the birthright citizenship order.
The universal
now the
order
court
kind of thing.
Yes, now the court is going to take up the main question, which is Trump's effort to limit this promise of citizenship to anyone born in the country or almost anyone born in the country, does that violate the Constitution and the Supreme Court's precedents? So the court has now said, yes, they're definitely going to weigh in. They're going to hear arguments, and it will likely be in March or April that those arguments take place. So that's kind of the typical schedule where there will be this announcement that the court is hearing the case, but then it takes quite a while for the court to work it onto its schedule.
Interesting. Well, we'll be watching that as well, and I'm sure that we'll be in touch with you again, Kelsey. Kelsey Dallas, managing editor of SCOTUSBlog, who's very generous about joining.
Yeah, that was some great analysis.
Yeah, it really is. And I'm the legal geek, and
I just sat back and listened because I was
yeah.
like, yeah, she knows what she's talking about.
Definitely does.